The security officer's words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Ma'am, your husband and son just tried to smuggle illegal substances using your luggage." My new husband Richard didn't even flinch when they called my name over the airport speaker. But my son Jake's eyes met his for just a split second, and that look told me everything I needed to know. Standing alone in that sterile security office, watching footage of them carefully placing wrapped packages in my suitcase while I was in the hotel shower, I realized my perfect honeymoon had been the perfect setup. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me take you back to how I ended up in the worst nightmare of my 52-year-old life. 3 months earlier, Richard Calloway had swept into my world like something out of a romance novel. Tall, silver-haired, charming as the devil himself, he'd approached me at my neighborhood coffee shop with the kind of confidence that usually made me suspicious. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help noticing you're reading Agatha Christie, a woman of excellent taste." I'd looked up from my book to find the most attractive man I'd seen in years smiling down at me. I should have trusted my instincts. Should have wondered why a successful contractor in his 50s was suddenly interested in a widowed school librarian. But after 8 years of lonely evenings and empty dinners for one, his attention felt like sunshine after a long winter. "I'm Richard," he'd said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Mind if I join you?" Within 2 weeks, he was bringing me flowers. Within a month, he was cooking dinner in my kitchen while my son Jake watched from the corner. Arms crossed, scowling like a teenager instead of the 28-year-old man he was. "Mom, don't you think this is moving too fast?" Jake had asked one evening after Richard left. "You barely know this guy." I'd smiled, still giddy from Richard's attention, still floating on the intoxicating feeling of being desired again. "Honey, when you've been alone as long as I have, you don't waste time when something good comes along." Jake's expression had darkened. Something good, or someone too good to be true? I'd dismissed his concerns as overprotectiveness. Jake had been living with me since his divorce 2 years ago, helping with the mortgage, being the good son I'd raised him to be, or so I thought. Now, staring at that security footage, I realized there had been signs, late-night phone calls he'd take outside, Richard showing up at the house when Jake wasn't there, asking casual questions about my routine, my finances, my insurance policies. The way they both seemed so interested in the details of our Cancun honeymoon, especially which hotel we'd stay at and what our luggage looked like. "Mrs. Morrison, or is it Mrs. Calloway now?" Officer Martinez asked, pulling me back to the present nightmare. "We need to understand how much you knew about this operation." The way she said operation made my blood turn to ice. This wasn't some stupid mistake or moment of poor judgment. This was planned, orchestrated, and I was the unwitting star of the show. "I had no idea," I told Officer Martinez, my voice barely steady. "But you need to understand something about my son and my husband." She raised an eyebrow, pen poised over her notepad. "They've been planning this from the beginning, haven't they?" The words tasted bitter as I spoke them, but saying them out loud made everything crystallize with horrifying clarity. Officer Martinez nodded slowly. "We've been tracking Richard Calloway for 6 months. This is his 4th marriage in 5 years. Same pattern every time. Whirlwind romance, quick wedding, honeymoon to a location known for drug trafficking, then the wife becomes the unwitting mule." I felt my knees buckle. She quickly guided me to a chair. "Mrs. Morrison, you're not in trouble. You're a victim. But we need your help to understand how your son fits into this." My son. My baby boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. The child I'd sacrificed everything for after his father left us when Jake was 12. I'd worked double shifts at the library and cleaned houses on weekends to keep us afloat. I'd given up dating, given up my own dreams, given up everything to make sure Jake had stability, love, a future. "How long?" I whispered. "How long has Jake been working with Richard?" Based on our surveillance, we believe they've known each other for at least 6 months before Richard approached you. 6 months. My perfect love story had been a business transaction. Officer Martinez continued. "We have footage of them meeting at a bar downtown, planning the approach. Your son provided detailed information about your routines, your vulnerabilities, your finances. I thought about all those evenings Jake had seemed so supportive of my relationship with Richard. 'Mom, you deserve happiness,' he'd say. 'Richard's good for you. You're glowing.' I'd been so grateful for his approval, so relieved that my two favorite men were getting along. The memory made me nauseous now. They played me perfectly, I said, more to myself than to Officer Martinez. Your son was promised 30% of whatever they could extract from you. Your life insurance, your house equity, your retirement savings. Richard specializes in widows and divorcees with assets but limited family connections. She paused, studying my face. Mrs. Morrison, did you recently update your will or insurance beneficiaries? My heart stopped. 2 weeks after we got engaged, Richard had suggested we both update our wills to protect each other. He'd even recommended a lawyer, his friend. He said, I'd changed everything. My house, my life insurance, my retirement accounts. Everything now went to Richard, with Jake as secondary beneficiary. Oh God, I breathed. If this smuggling thing had worked, if I'd been arrested, you'd be in federal prison for 20 to life. Your assets would be tied up in legal proceedings for years, eventually reverting to your beneficiaries once you were declared legally unable to manage them. Officer Martinez's voice was gentle but firm. Mrs. Morrison, they weren't just using you to smuggle drugs. They were setting you up to lose everything, including your freedom. I sat in that sterile chair, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and felt my entire identity crumble. I wasn't a beloved new wife or a treasured mother. I was a mark, a target, a middle-aged woman whose loneliness and trust had made her the perfect victim. But as the shock began to wear off, something else started building in my chest. Something that felt suspiciously like rage. I need to see them, I told Officer Martinez. She looked surprised. Mrs. Morrison, I don't think that's advisable. They're being processed, and emotions are running high. But I wasn't asking anymore. I need to see their faces when they realize their plan failed. The steel in my own voice surprised me. 20 minutes later, I stood behind a two-way mirror, watching Richard pace frantically in an interrogation room while Jake sat slumped in a chair, head in his hands. Richard was still handsome, still charming, but now I could see what I'd missed before, the calculating coldness behind his practiced smile, the way his eyes constantly assessed and measured. "Where's Linda?" I heard him demand through the intercom. That was my real name, though everyone called me Lindy. Hearing him say it with such casual ownership made my skin crawl. She doesn't know anything. She's completely innocent. This is all a misunderstanding. Even now, even caught red-handed, he was spinning the narrative, trying to paint himself as my protector. Jake finally looked up, his face streaked with tears. "She's going to hate me forever," he said to Richard. "I told you this was too risky. I told you she wasn't as naive as your other wives." Other wives. The phrase hit me like ice water. How many women had they done this to? How many middle-aged hearts had Richard broken while emptying bank accounts and destroying lives? "Your son seems to have some regrets," Officer Martinez observed quietly. I watched Jake wipe his nose with his sleeve, looking every bit the scared little boy I'd comforted through scraped knees and bad dreams. "But not enough to stop him from betraying me," I replied. "Officer Martinez, what happens next?" She turned to face me fully. "For them? Federal drug trafficking charges, conspiracy, fraud. They're looking at serious prison time. For you?" She paused. "That depends on what you want to do." I raised an eyebrow. "Waiting. We've been trying to catch Richard's operation for 2 years. With your testimony and cooperation, we can not only put him away, but potentially identify other victims, maybe prevent future ones." I thought about other women like me, other lonely widows or divorcees who'd fallen for Richard's practiced charm, other sons who'd sold out their mothers for 30 pieces of silver. What do I need to do? The question surprised me. I'd never been a vengeful person, never been someone who fought back. But then again, I'd never been betrayed this completely before. Testify. Help us understand the timeline, the manipulation tactics, the financial component. Your marriage to Richard gives us access to evidence we couldn't get otherwise. Officer Martinez paused. "Mrs. Morrison, this won't be easy. Your son will likely try to minimize his involvement, make you feel guilty for pursuing charges. Richard will try to convince you he really loves you, that he was coerced or threatened." Through the glass, I watched Richard check his expensive watch, the one I'd helped him pick out for our wedding. He'd told me it was a family heirloom, but now I wondered how many other wives had heard that same lie. "When I married him 3 days ago," I said slowly, I promised to love, honor, and cherish him. I promised for better or worse, for richer or poorer. Officer Martinez nodded sympathetically. I understand if you need time to think about. I also promised to be faithful, I interrupted, my voice growing stronger. And faithfulness works both ways. He broke those vows the moment he saw me as a mark instead of a wife. I turned away from the mirror, decision made. When do we start? The old Lindy Morrison would have made excuses for them, found ways to blame herself, tried to salvage the relationships at any cost. But that woman had died in this airport security office, watching footage of her own son and husband plotting her destruction. The woman walking out of here was someone new entirely. Someone who understood that sometimes the people you love most are the ones capable of hurting you worst. And sometimes, just sometimes, they deserve exactly what they get. The next morning, I sat in Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen's office, wearing the same clothes I'd traveled in because everything else was still evidence. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of my best students. Mrs. Morrison, I've reviewed your case, and I want to be completely honest with you about what you're facing. She spread photographs across her desk, pictures of Richard with 3 other women, all around my age, all looking blissfully happy on what appeared to be honeymoons. Margaret Stevens, 58, married Richard in Atlantic City. Honeymoon in Jamaica. She's currently serving 15 years for drug trafficking. My stomach clenched. Patricia Williams, 55, married him in Vegas. Honeymoon in Colombia. She died in federal prison last year from a heart attack. I stared at Patricia's photograph. She had kind eyes and graying brown hair. Looked like someone who'd bake cookies for her grandchildren. She was diabetic, Sarah continued quietly. Prison medical care wasn't adequate. Her family is suing, but that won't bring her back. The weight of what I'd escaped hit me like a freight train. That could have been my obituary. That could have been Jake reading about his mother's death in a federal prison. The third woman, Carol Thompson, 62, was luckier. She became suspicious during the honeymoon and refused to pack anything she hadn't personally inspected. When customs found drugs in Richard's luggage instead of hers, she testified against him. But by then, he'd already emptied her retirement accounts and taken out loans against her house. She lost everything, ended up homeless for 6 months before her sister took her in. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Your case is different because of your son's involvement. Jake has information about Richard's network that could help us catch the bigger fish. But he's also facing serious charges himself. The question is, are you prepared for the possibility that your son might go to prison for a very long time? I thought about Jake's face last night, how young and scared he'd looked. Then I thought about Patricia Williams dying alone in a prison cell because her diabetic medication wasn't properly managed. Sarah, can I ask you something? She nodded. Do you have children? Her expression softened slightly. A daughter. She's 7. If she were 28 and had betrayed you the way Jake betrayed me, what would you do? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I'd want to know why. I'd want to understand how it got to that point. And then I'd have to decide whether justice was more important than family. She paused. But Mrs. Morrison, that's a choice only you can make. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city courthouse. Somewhere in this building, Jake was probably meeting with a public defender, being advised to minimize his role, to blame Richard for everything. Part of me hoped he would. Part of me still wanted to protect the little boy who used to bring me dandelions and tell me I was the best mom in the world. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since yesterday, remembered that little boy had grown into a man who'd helped orchestrate my destruction for money. Sarah, I need to know something. When Richard approached me in that coffee shop, acting like it was chance, acting like he was smitten, I turned back to face her. Jake set that up, didn't he? Sarah consulted her files. According to our surveillance, Jake had been feeding Richard information about your routines for weeks. What time you went to the coffee shop, what you ordered, what books you read. Richard practiced that approach multiple times. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. My own son had studied me like a lab rat, cataloging my habits and weaknesses for a predator. I want to see him, I said suddenly. I want to hear him explain it to my face. Sarah looked concerned. Mrs. Morrison, his lawyer will advise him not to speak with you. And honestly, it might not be the closure you're hoping for. She was probably right, but I needed to look into my son's eyes one more time. I needed to understand if there was anything left of the boy I'd raised, or if that person had been completely consumed by greed and selfishness. Set up the meeting, I said firmly. If he won't talk to me, fine, but I'm going to give him the chance to tell me the truth. After 28 years of being his mother, I think I've earned that much. The jailhouse visiting room smelled like industrial disinfectant and despair. I sat across from Jake, separated by thick plexiglass, speaking through a crackling phone that made his voice sound hollow and distant. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Mom, I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to go this far. How far did you want it to go, Jake? My voice was calmer than I felt. Did you think I'd just disappear quietly when you and Richard were done with me? He finally looked up, and I saw something I'd never seen in my son's face before. Genuine fear. Not fear of consequences, but fear of who he'd become. It started as just information, he said, words tumbling out rapidly. Richard approached me at Murphy's bar, said he was interested in you romantically, wanted to know what you liked, how to make you happy. It seemed sweet. I held up my hand to stop him. When did it stop being sweet, Jake? His shoulders sagged. When he offered me money. Real money. $15,000 just for details about your finances, your routine, your vulnerabilities. $15,000. That's what my son's loyalty had cost. And when he offered more money to help with the smuggling operation? Jake's face crumpled. $50,000, Mom. He promised me $50,000 if I helped set it up properly. Do you know what that kind of money would mean for me? I thought about the college tuition I'd sacrificed my retirement savings for. The car payments I'd helped him with when he was unemployed. The down payment on his first apartment that had come from my emergency fund. I know exactly what $50,000 means, Jake. I've given you more than that over the years, and I never asked you to betray me for it. You don't understand, he said, frustration bleeding into his voice. You have the house, your pension, your savings. You're set for life. I'm 28, divorced, living in your basement, working construction jobs that barely pay minimum wage. I needed something, Mom. I needed a chance. So you decided to destroy mine? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't regret them. Jake, do you know what would have happened if their plan had worked? Do you know about Richard's other wives? His face went pale. What other wives? I told him about Margaret, Patricia, and Carol. Watched him realize that his get-rich-quick scheme would have resulted in his mother's death or imprisonment. Patricia Williams died in prison, Jake. She had diabetes, and the prison medical system failed her. Is that what you wanted for me? $50,000 in exchange for your mother's life? He was crying now, ugly sobs that shook his whole body. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the other women. Richard told me you'd just get probation, maybe community service. He said wealthy women never do real time for first offenses. The casual manipulation in Richard's strategy didn't surprise me, but it added another layer of revulsion to the whole situation. Jake, I need you to understand something, I said, my voice steady despite the tears running down my own cheeks. I love you. I will always love you because you're my son. But love doesn't mean trust, and it doesn't mean consequences don't matter. He looked up sharply. You're going to testify against me. I'm going to tell the truth. About Richard. About his operation. About how you helped him target me. I paused, choosing my words carefully. What you do with the opportunity to cooperate with the prosecution is up to you. But Jake, our relationship as it was, that's over. The mother who would have sacrificed everything to protect you, she died yesterday when I watched that security footage. He slammed his hand against the plexiglass. So that's it? 28 years of being your son, and you're just going to throw it away? I stood up slowly, my decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. You threw it away the moment you decided I was worth more to you as a victim than as a mother. I hung up the phone and walked away, leaving Jake shouting my name through the glass. In the parking lot, I sat in the rental car Sarah's office had provided and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not grief or anger or betrayal, though all those emotions were still there. What I felt was freedom. Freedom from the burden of protecting people who were willing to destroy me. Freedom from the obligation to forgive the unforgivable just because we shared DNA. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard, somehow smuggled out through another inmate. Lindy, please come see me. I can explain everything. What we have is real. I deleted the message without reading it twice. Then I started the car and drove toward my new life, leaving the wreckage of my old one exactly where it belonged, behind me. Tomorrow, I would start building something new. Tonight, I was simply going to appreciate being alive, free, and finally awake to what I was actually worth. And for the first time in years, I was looking forward to finding out who I could become when I stopped trying to save people who were determined to drown me. 3 weeks into the investigation, Sarah Chen called me with news that made my blood run cold. We found Richard's real operation base. Mrs. Morrison, this is bigger than we thought. I sat in my temporary apartment, a furnished studio the victim services program had helped me secure, staring at crime scene photos she'd brought over. The warehouse in Newark contained detailed files on over 50 women, not just wives, but targets, ages, financial situations, psychological profiles, even notes about their deceased husbands and emotional vulnerabilities. My file was 3 inches thick. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a note in Richard's handwriting. "Lindy Morrison, desperate for validation after 8 years alone, responds to intellectual flattery and traditional romance gestures. Son Jake is financially struggling and emotionally dependent. Perfect leverage. Perfect leverage. That's what my relationship with my son had been reduced to, a weakness to exploit. But seeing it written out so clinically actually helped. It wasn't my fault for loving my child. It was their calculation to weaponize that love against me. "Sarah, what's this column marked Timeline to Extraction?" I asked, pointing to a chart with my name at the top. "Richard's operational plan for your relationship. See here? Month 1 through 6, establish trust and emotional dependency. Month 7 through 12, legal entanglements and financial access. Month 13, Sarah paused. Month 13 was when you were supposed to die in federal prison or from a medical emergency while incarcerated. I studied the timeline with the detached fascination of someone reading their own obituary. He really thought of everything, didn't he? But as I read further, something didn't add up. "Sarah, this says the smuggling operation was Plan B. What was Plan A?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Life insurance fraud. He was going to arrange an accident during your honeymoon. Make it look like you drowned while snorkeling or had a fatal allergic reaction to something. Much cleaner than the drug conviction route. But the timing got compressed when he found out about your upcoming medical checkup." My medical checkup? I was confused for a moment, then remembered. Oh, my annual physical. Dr. Richards wanted to update my prescriptions and run some routine tests. Sarah nodded grimly. Richard couldn't risk a doctor discovering any health issues that might complicate an insurance payout. So he switched to Plan B, frame you for drug trafficking and let the justice system do his dirty work. I walked to the window, processing this information. Below, normal people were living normal lives, completely unaware that predators like Richard Calloway moved among them, cataloging weaknesses and planning destructions. How many women did he actually kill, Sarah? We're still investigating, but based on what we've found so far, at least 7 confirmed deaths, possibly more. Heart attacks in prison, suicides in custody, 1 car accident right before trial that we now believe was staged. 7 women, 7 mothers, daughters, wives who'd trusted the wrong charming man and paid for it with their lives. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. Sarah nodded for me to answer and gestured to the recording equipment she'd brought. "Hello?" The voice was female, older, shaky with nerves. "Is this Linda Morrison? The woman who was married to Richard Calloway?" "Yes." "Who is this?" I heard a deep breath, then words that made me sink into my chair. "My name is Helen Rogers. Richard was married to my sister Margaret, the one serving time for drug trafficking. Margaret Stevens, the woman from the photos. Helen, I'm so sorry about your sister. Mrs. Morrison, Margaret is innocent. We all knew it, but nobody would listen to us. But when I saw your story on the news, when I heard about his pattern," her voice broke. "I need to know if you'll help me, if there's a way to save my sister before it's too late." I looked at Sarah, who was already pulling up files on her laptop. This wasn't just about justice for me anymore. This was about women who were still suffering for Richard's crimes, still paying for his manipulations. "Helen, tell me everything. And yes, I'll help however I can. By the time Helen finished talking, I understood that my choice to testify wasn't just about punishing Richard and Jake. It was about saving lives. Margaret Stevens had already attempted suicide twice in prison. Carol Thompson was living in a homeless shelter because Richard had destroyed her credit and cleaned out her accounts. And somewhere out there, Richard's network was probably already targeting their next victim. "Sarah," I said after Helen hung up, "I want to do more than just testify. I want to help you catch all of them." 10 months later, I stood in a federal courtroom wearing my best Navy suit, the one I'd bought for job interviews after my divorce, but never needed as a librarian. Today, I was testifying against the man I'd promised to love, honor, and cherish until death do us part. The irony wasn't lost on me that death had almost done us part, just not in the way either of us had anticipated. Richard looked different in his orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow, less magnetic. Without his expensive suits and practiced charm, he was just another middle-aged criminal trying to convince a jury that everyone else was lying. His lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Graves, had tried every angle to discredit me during cross-examination. "Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that you initiated the relationship with my client?" she'd asked, pacing in front of the jury box like a predator. "That you pursued him aggressively because you were desperate for companionship after 8 years alone?" I'd looked her directly in the eyes. "Ms. Graves, I was reading a book in a coffee shop. Your client approached me with a practiced line about Agatha Christie that we now know he'd used on at least 6 other women. If you consider sitting quietly with a novel to be aggressive pursuit, I'd hate to see what you think actual flirtation looks like." Several jury members had smothered smiles at that response. Patricia Graves had tried a different approach. "You've admitted that you updated your will and insurance policies to benefit Mr. Calloway. Doesn't that suggest you were fully invested in this relationship, not the victim of manipulation?" "Ms. Graves, when someone you trust convinces you to make them your beneficiary and then tries to arrange your death or imprisonment, that's not investment. That's being set up." I'd paused, letting that sink in. Though I suppose from your client's perspective, the distinction doesn't matter much. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Financial records, surveillance footage, testimony from Richard's previous victims, the detailed files found in his warehouse. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: Jake's full cooperation. My son had agreed to testify against Richard in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his inside knowledge of the operation was devastating. Watching Jake take the stand had been one of the hardest moments of my life. He looked thin and pale, wearing an ill-fitting suit that made him appear younger than his 28 years. When the prosecutor asked him to explain his role, his voice was barely audible. "Richard recruited me 6 months before he approached my mother. He paid me to provide information about her habits, her finances, her emotional vulnerabilities. And did you know what Mr. Calloway intended to do with this information?" Jake had looked directly at me for the first time since his arrest. At first, I thought it was just romance stuff. But when he started asking about her life insurance policies and health conditions, he paused, swallowing hard. I knew something was wrong, but by then, he was paying me too much to walk away. The prosecutor had pressed him. "Mr. Morrison, did there come a time when you learned that Mr. Calloway intended to harm your mother?" Jake's composure had cracked completely. He told me she would just do a little jail time. He said wealthy women with good lawyers never served real sentences for first drug offenses. I didn't know about the other wives who died. I swear I didn't know. Richard's lawyer had tried to paint Jake as the mastermind, suggesting he'd manipulated Richard into targeting me. But Jake's cooperation with the investigation, his obvious remorse, and the overwhelming evidence of Richard's pattern made that narrative impossible to sustain. The jury saw Jake for what he was, a weak man who'd made terrible choices, but not the architect of a murder-for-profit scheme. During a recess, Jake approached me in the hallway. His public defender had probably advised against it, but he came anyway. "Mom, I know you'll probably never forgive me, but I need you to know that seeing those files, learning about what he did to other women, I realize now that I helped plan your murder." I studied my son's face, looking for any trace of the little boy I'd raised. What I saw was a man who'd finally understood the true cost of his choices. "Jake, forgiveness isn't something I can give you. It's something you'll have to earn by living differently going forward." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "But I'm glad you chose to tell the truth." even if it came too late to prevent the damage. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I'm going to get help. Mom, therapy, maybe join one of those programs for people who've hurt their families. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to understand why I did it. For the first time since his arrest, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, somewhere deep down, the son I'd raised was still in there. I hope you do, Jake, and I hope you find a way to live with yourself that doesn't involve hurting other people. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was simply honesty, the thing that had been missing from our relationship for far too long. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman, a middle-aged black woman who'd reminded me of my best friend from college, stood with the kind of solemnity that usually accompanies life-changing pronouncements. We find the defendant, Richard James Calloway, guilty on all counts. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of fraud. Guilty of drug trafficking. Guilty of racketeering. The charges kept coming, each guilty verdict hitting Richard like a physical blow. I watched his face cycle through denial, anger, and finally a kind of empty resignation as he realized his charm had finally failed him. Judge Patricia Wang, a stern woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and piercing brown eyes, scheduled sentencing for the following month. But she had some words for Richard before the bailiff led him away. Mr. Calloway, in 30 years on this bench, I've seen many criminals who've caused immeasurable harm through violence, through greed, through callousness. But rarely have I seen someone weaponize trust and love as systematically as you have. She paused, looking directly at him. You didn't just commit crimes, Mr. Calloway. You corrupted the most fundamental human connections, marriage, family, love itself, and turned them into tools of exploitation. The sentence you receive will reflect not just the harm you've caused, but the particular cruelty of how you caused it. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. I'd become something of a local celebrity, the librarian who'd survived a murder plot and brought down a criminal network. Mrs. Morrison, how do you feel about the verdict? One of them shouted. I'd prepared a statement, but looking at those cameras, I decided to speak from the heart instead. I feel relieved that Richard Calloway will never hurt another woman the way he hurt me and his previous victims. But mostly, I feel sad that it took so many women suffering and dying for the system to take this seriously. I paused, thinking about Margaret Stevens still serving time for Richard's crimes. This verdict is just the beginning. There are still innocent women in prison because of Richard's manipulations, and there are still predators out there using the same tactics. A reporter from Channel 7 pushed forward. What's next for you, Mrs. Morrison? It was a fair question, and one I'd been thinking about constantly. What did you do after your entire life had been revealed as an elaborate fraud? How did you rebuild when everything you'd trusted had been designed to destroy you? I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure other women don't go through what I went through, I said simply. There are patterns to this kind of predatory behavior, warning signs that can save lives if people know what to look for. I'm going to make sure they know. That evening, I sat in my small apartment with Helen Rogers and Carol Thompson. We'd formed an unlikely sisterhood, the survivors and families of Richard's victims. Carol had driven up from North Carolina, where she'd been living with her daughter since losing her house. Helen had flown in from Michigan, using money she'd borrowed to attend the trial. What do you think his sentence will be? Carol asked. She looked much older than her 62 years. The stress of losing everything and starting over, having aged her prematurely. Sarah thinks life without parole, I replied. With the murder charges and the federal racketeering conviction, he'll never see the outside of a prison again. Helen was quieter, picking at the takeout Chinese food we'd ordered. I keep thinking about Margaret, she said finally. She's been in prison for 3 years now for something she didn't do. Even if we get her conviction overturned, we can't give her back those years. She was right, and that knowledge sat heavy in the room. Helen, Sarah told me there's been progress on Margaret's appeal, I said gently. The evidence from Richard's warehouse, his conviction, Jake's testimony about the pattern, it's all grounds for overturning her conviction. It might take time, but there's real hope now. Carol looked up from her food. You know what the hardest part is? It's not even the money or the house. It's trusting myself again. How do I ever believe that someone actually cares about me, not just what they can take from me? Her question hung in the air because none of us had an answer. That was the real damage Richard had done. It wasn't just the financial destruction or even the threat to our lives. It was the way he'd poisoned our ability to trust, to love, to believe in genuine human connection. Every future relationship would be shadowed by the knowledge of how completely we'd been fooled. But sitting there with Helen and Carol, sharing stories and supporting each other, I realized something important. Richard had tried to destroy our faith in other people, but he'd failed. We were 3 women who barely knew each other, brought together by shared trauma, and yet we were caring for each other in ways that felt completely genuine. Maybe that was how healing would work, not by learning to trust blindly again, but by building connections slowly, carefully, with people who'd earned that trust through their actions rather than their words. The call came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before Richard's sentencing. Sarah Chen's voice was tight with excitement and something that sounded like barely controlled anger. "Mrs. Morrison, we found them. We found Richard's partners." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. Partners? During the trial, we'd learned that Richard's operation was sophisticated enough to require financial backing and logistical support. But the investigation had focused primarily on Richard himself and his direct victims. His handlers, the people funding the operation and laundering the money. Mrs. Morrison, Richard wasn't the mastermind. He was middle management. Sarah's words hit me like ice water. "Can you come to my office immediately? There's something you need to see, and we need to move fast." An hour later, I sat in Sarah's office staring at surveillance photos of people I'd never seen before, except for one face that made my blood freeze. "That's Dr. Martindale," I whispered, recognizing my insurance agent. The man who'd helped Richard and me update our policies, who'd been so helpful and understanding about our romantic desire to protect each other financially. Dr. Anthony Martindale, licensed insurance agent and certified financial planner. He's been working with Richard for over 5 years, identifying targets and facilitating the financial components of these operations. Sarah spread out more photos. Here he is with Patricia Williams' insurance claim. Here with Margaret Stevens' policy. And here, she paused, sliding another photo toward me. Here he is meeting with your son Jake 2 months before Richard approached you. The betrayal hit deeper than I'd expected. Jake hadn't just agreed to help Richard. He'd been recruited by a professional network that had studied me, assessed my value, and determined I was worth murdering for my assets. How many people were involved in targeting me? At least 8 that we can identify so far. Financial planners, lawyers, private investigators who researched your background, even a retired police officer who provided advice on how to make murders look accidental. Sarah pulled up an organizational chart on her computer. "Mrs. Morrison, you weren't the victim of a crime of opportunity. You were the subject of a coordinated business operation." I studied the chart, seeing my name at the center of a web that included people I'd never heard of and a few I had. "Sarah, is that Judge Morrison?" I pointed to a name in the corner, feeling sick. "Please tell me that's not related to—" She nodded grimly. "Judge Harold Morrison, the probate judge who would have handled your estate after your death. He was paid by the network to expedite certain proceedings." The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. They'd infiltrated the legal system, the financial services industry, even law enforcement. "How did you find all this?" I asked, overwhelmed by the complexity of what we were facing. "Anonymous tip," Sarah said with a slight smile. "Someone sent us a storage unit key and an address. When we searched it, we found records going back 8 years. Financial statements, operational plans, victim profiles, even video recordings of planning meetings." She paused. "Mrs. Morrison, I think someone on the inside got scared after Richard's conviction and decided to expose the whole operation." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The storage unit was just the beginning. "Check your email." I looked at Sarah, who nodded for me to check. In my inbox was a message from an encrypted account with a single attachment, a video file labeled Morrison Planning Meeting.mp4. I clicked play, and Richard's voice filled the room, clear as day. "Linda Morrison is perfect. Isolated, financially stable, emotionally vulnerable after her husband's death. Her son is desperate enough to help, and she trusts authority figures implicitly. The video showed Richard sitting around a conference table with 6 other people, including Dr. Martindale and Jake. But it was the next part that made me gasp. The timeline is accelerated because we have competition, Richard continued. There's another group targeting her, but they're planning a romance scam that could take years. Our approach is more direct and profitable. Another group. There had been multiple criminal organizations competing to destroy me. Jake's voice came through clearly. She's already updating her will based on what Richard suggests. The life insurance changes go into effect next month. My son wasn't just helping Richard. He was providing operational updates to a room full of conspirators who were planning my murder. Mrs. Morrison, are you okay? Sarah asked gently. I realized I'd been holding my breath. Sarah, who sent this video? Who's helping us? She shook her head. We don't know yet, but whoever it is, they have access to the highest levels of this organization, and they're giving us everything we need to shut it down completely. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang again. The same unknown number. I answered on speaker. Mrs. Morrison, this is someone who was part of Richard's operation. The voice was electronically disguised, impossible to identify. I helped target you, and I'm sorry, but I'm done being part of something that kills innocent people. Why are you helping us? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Because my daughter is getting married next month, and yesterday I realized that in 10 years, she could be someone like you. Someone could target her the same way we targeted you. I can't live with that knowledge. The caller continued. There are more storage units, more evidence, and Mrs. Morrison, there are 3 other women currently being targeted by the same network. If we move fast enough, we might be able to save them before it's too late. I looked at Sarah, decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about prevention. Tell us where to look, I said into the phone, and tell us how we stop them before they kill anyone else. 6 months later, I stood in a ballroom at the Marriott downtown, looking out at 200 faces that represented the most unlikely audience of my life. Crime victims, federal agents, prosecutors, social workers, and journalists had gathered for the first annual conference on predatory relationship fraud. I'd helped organize it, but I never expected this many people to care about an issue that most of society preferred to ignore. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. 18 months ago, I was a 52-year-old librarian who thought the most dangerous thing in my life was an overdue book fine. Today, I'm speaking to you as someone who survived a coordinated murder plot orchestrated by people I trusted most in the world. The room was dead silent. I'd learned that starting with the harsh truth got people's attention faster than any gentle introduction. I'm here because the network that targeted me was just one of dozens operating across the country. Because in the time it took to bring Richard Calloway to justice, his colleagues successfully murdered 4 more women and are currently targeting at least 12 others. I clicked to my first slide, showing photographs of Richard's confirmed victims. These women died because they believed in love, because they trusted family members, because they thought financial advisors and insurance agents and lawyers were there to help them, not hunt them. My voice caught slightly on Margaret Stevens' photo. She'd been released from prison 2 months ago, but 3 years of incarceration had broken her health permanently. But today isn't about the victims who didn't make it. Today is about the ones we can still save. I clicked to the next slide, showing the organizational chart Sarah and I had developed with help from our anonymous informant, who we'd learned was Dr. Martindale's former assistant. Predatory relationship fraud follows predictable patterns. The perpetrators target specific demographics, use repeatable manipulation techniques, and leave traceable financial footprints. Over the next hour, I walked the audience through everything we'd learned. How to recognize the warning signs when a new romantic interest shows unusual interest in financial details. How isolation tactics work. How family members get recruited. How professional networks of lawyers, financial advisors, and even judges can be corrupted to facilitate these crimes. The hardest lesson for me, I said, nearing the end of my presentation, was accepting that my son's betrayal wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It was a calculated business decision facilitated by people who understood exactly how to weaponize family relationships. I paused, seeing some audience members nod in recognition. Jake is serving 3 years in federal prison and will be on supervised probation for 5 more. We speak occasionally, supervised conversations where he's working to understand the psychological manipulation he both experienced and participated in. I don't know if we'll ever have a real relationship again, but I hope he'll use his experience to help other families avoid what happened to us. The questions afterward were insightful and sometimes heartbreaking. A woman from Ohio, whose mother had died in suspicious circumstances that were ruled accidental, but followed Richard's pattern exactly. A federal agent who'd identified similar networks in Florida and Texas. A prosecutor asking for advice on how to help victims testify effectively when they'd been traumatized by people they'd loved. But the most important conversation happened during the break, when a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Morrison, I think my grandmother is being targeted. She's 78, widowed last year, and recently started dating a man she met at church. He's already asking about her will and life insurance." We spent 20 minutes going through the warning signs, the accelerated timeline of the relationship, the casual questions about family dynamics and financial security, the way he'd isolated her from friends who'd expressed concerns. "What should I do?" she asked desperately. "We're going to help you," I said, meaning it completely. "Here's my card and here's Sarah Chen's number. Call her tomorrow morning and explain everything. We have protocols now for situations exactly like this." The relief on her face reminded me why this work mattered. That evening, I sat in my new apartment, a bright 2-bedroom place I'd bought with the settlement money from my insurance company, who'd paid out handsomely rather than face a lawsuit over their agent's criminal activities. My landline rang, a number I recognized now. "Mrs. Morrison, it's Carol." Carol Thompson had become one of my closest friends, the kind of relationship forged by shared survival rather than shared interests. "I wanted to let you know, I got the job." Carol had been hired as a victim advocate by the North Carolina Attorney General's office, specializing in financial crimes against older adults. Helen Rogers had started a nonprofit in Michigan focused on supporting families of incarceration victims. Even Margaret Stevens, despite her health issues, was working with a legal aid organization to help other wrongfully convicted women. "That's wonderful, Carol. You'll be brilliant at it." And she would be. Nobody understood the psychological aftermath of predatory fraud like someone who'd lived through it. "How does it feel to be starting over at 63? She laughed, a sound that had taken months to return to her voice. Terrifying and liberating at the same time. I never thought I'd say this, but losing everything might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. I know who I am now in a way I never did before. I knew exactly what she meant. The woman who'd sat in that coffee shop 18 months ago, reading Agatha Christie and hoping for romance, had been naive in ways that could have killed her. The woman I'd become was harder, more suspicious, less trusting. But she was also stronger, more independent, and absolutely certain of her own worth. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Final verdict on the network prosecutions. All 8 defendants convicted. Judge Morrison got 20 years. Dr. Martindale got life without parole. Anonymous informant has been relocated with new identity. Justice served." I smiled, pouring myself a glass of the good wine I'd started buying, since learning that life was too short to save nice things for special occasions. Tomorrow I'd wake up in my own home, make my own decisions, and spend my day helping other women avoid the trap I'd barely escaped. Richard Calloway was serving 4 consecutive life sentences and would die in prison. Jake was learning to live with the consequences of his choices. And somewhere out there, the next woman these predators tried to target would have resources and information that hadn't existed when they came for me. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the women who hadn't made it, to the ones still fighting, and to the stubborn refusal to let evil win without a fight. Then I opened my laptop and started writing my next presentation, because there was still work to do, and I was just getting started.